The auction yard smelled of whiskey, dust, and shame, and Jonah Caldwell hated himself for standing there, hat pulled low. Hands shoved deep into his coat pockets as men laughed too loudly and women looked away too quickly. Because this wasn't cattle being sold today, it was something far worse. Something that made the late afternoon sun feel cruel, as it burned down on a small, thin girl, standing beside a drunken man who swayed on his boots and slurred his words. His hand gripping her shoulder like she was property, like she was a sack of grain instead of a human soul, and Jonah had told himself he was only there to buy a mule. Only there because the long winter had left his ranch understaffed and lonely. But the moment he saw her, barefoot, dress torn at the hem, hair falling like dark curtains around a face too calm for a child who should have been terrified, he knew that lie would never hold. The auctioneer's voice boomed, joking, mocking, calling her deaf as a fence post, telling the crowd she wouldn't hear orders, wouldn't argue back, wouldn't cry too loud, and the men laughed. Because men often laugh when cruelty wears a smile, and Jonah felt something old and sharp twist in his chest. The same pain he'd felt the day he buried his wife and unborn son beneath a cottonwood tree on his land, the day the world had gone silent in a different way. The drunk father shouted that she was useless, that she couldn't hear a damn thing, that feeding her was a waste, and the girl didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't react at all. Her eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the crowd, as if she'd already learned the safest place to be was inside herself. And Jonah realized with a sickness in his gut that everyone believed the story. That she was deaf, broken, easy to sell, and maybe that's why no one noticed the way her fingers trembled when voices rose, or how her breathing changed when anger sharpened the air. Signs so small only someone who'd learned grief's language might see them. The bidding started low, insultingly low, and Jonah stood frozen as numbers were shouted, each one a knife cutting deeper into his conscience, because he knew if he walked away, he'd carry her face with him forever, knew the silence of his ranch would become unbearable if he left her here. And when a man with yellow teeth and cruel eyes laughed and raised his hand, Jonah felt his body move before his mind could argue, his voice cutting through the noise like a rifle crack as he named a price high enough to stop the laughter cold. The drunk father stared at Jonah with disbelief, then greed, then relief, because some men sell their souls cheap, and Jonah stepped forward as the gavel fell. His heart pounding like he'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and when he looked down at the girl, expecting fear or anger, he saw only that same distant calm. Her eyes lifting to meet his for the first time, dark and unreadable, and for a strange, unsettling moment, Jonah had thought that she understood far more than anyone suspected. He signed the papers with a hand that shook, paid the money, and when the father staggered away without looking back, Jonah felt a wave of fury so strong he nearly called him back just to hit him. But the girl was already stepping closer to Jonah, her small hand hovering near his coat sleeve, unsure, waiting for permission, and he swallowed hard, nodded gently. And she took his arm like it was the most natural thing in the world. The ride to the ranch passed in near silence, broken only by the creak of the wagon and the wind moving through dry grass, and Jonah kept stealing glances at her, trying to understand how someone could sit so still, so composed after what she'd been through, and when he spoke, softly, awkwardly, she didn't respond, didn't turn her head, didn't even blink. And guilt washed over him because of course she didn't, she was deaf, everyone said so, and yet there were moments, tiny ones, that unsettled him. Moments when his voice dropped suddenly and her shoulders tightened, or when a branch snapped and she turned a fraction of a second too late. As if she'd heard something but chosen not to acknowledge it, and Jonah told himself he was imagining things, that loneliness was playing tricks on his mind. Because the alternative, that the girl might be hiding something enormous, felt too heavy to carry. At the ranch, he showed her the small room near the kitchen, clean and warm, with a real bed and a quilt his wife had sewn years ago, and when he placed the quilt in her hands, her fingers brushed the stitching with reverence, eyes filling with something dangerously close to tears, and Jonah felt his throat close because kindness should never feel this shocking to a child. He tried to explain, using gestures, slow movements, that she was safe here, that no one would hurt her, that she could stay as long as she needed, and she watched him intently, nodding in places that made sense and others that didn't, as if she were reading more than his hands, as if she were reading his heart. That night, Jonah lay awake listening to the wind batter the house, wondering if he'd done the right thing, wondering if saving one broken soul could ever make up for the ones he'd lost. And in the small hours before dawn, he heard something that made him sit up, breath caught in his chest. A soft sound, barely there, coming from down the hall, a quiet, broken humming. Hesitant and afraid, and Jonah froze because deaf people didn't hum in tune, didn't catch melody the way that sound carried through the dark. And as he held his breath and listened, the truth crept in slowly, terrifying and profound, like the first light of morning over a wounded land. The girl he'd bought to save might not be as deaf as the world believed. And whatever silence she lived in, it was one she'd chosen to survive. And as that realization settled into his bones, Jonah Caldwell understood that his lonely ranch was about to become the center of a secret powerful enough to change both their lives forever. Morning came slowly to Jonah Caldwell's ranch. The kind of pale dawn that crept over the hills like it was unsure it belonged there, and Jonah hadn't slept, not really, because that soft humming still echoed in his head, winding through his thoughts until silence itself felt loud. And when he finally rose and stepped into the kitchen, he found the girl already awake. Seated at the table with her hands folded neatly in front of her, posture straight, eyes lowered, as if she were waiting to be told what kind of world this house would be. He greeted her gently, careful with his movements, still pretending he believed the lie everyone had agreed upon, and she looked up at him, nodding faintly, her expression calm but alert. And Jonah felt that strange unease again, that sense of standing beside a river whose depth he couldn't see. Over the next days, life settled into a fragile rhythm, and Jonah showed her the simple tasks of the ranch, feeding the chickens, sweeping the porch, helping prepare meals, and she learned with startling speed, watching him closely, copying movements after seeing them only once, never asking questions, never making mistakes that came from misunderstanding, only the occasional slip of inexperience. And Jonah began to realize that she wasn't merely surviving here, she was listening in her own way, absorbing everything, storing it like a secret she wasn't ready to share. The neighbors came eventually, as they always did, curious about the rumor that Jonah Caldwell had bought a deaf girl at auction, and Jonah braced himself for their stares. Their poorly hidden judgment, their jokes meant to disguise cruelty, and the girl shrank just slightly behind him when voices rose, her fingers brushing his sleeve, and Jonah felt a fierce, protective anger ignite in his chest, something he hadn't felt since his wife died, something that scared him because it meant he had something to lose again. The men spoke loudly, exaggerated their words, mocked her supposed silence, and Jonah watched closely as the girl kept her gaze lowered, face blank. But her body betrayed her in tiny ways, the tightening of her jaw at certain words, the subtle flinch when someone laughed too hard, and Jonah knew then, without doubt, that she heard them. Every ugly word, every careless insult, and that she chose silence not because she lacked sound, but because sound had hurt her too deeply to trust. That night when the house was quiet and the lamps burned low, Jonah finally did something brave enough to shatter the fragile peace between them, and he spoke her truth aloud, not accusing, not demanding but gentle, as if handling something already broken. He told her he had heard her humming, told her he believed she could hear, told her she was safe here and didn't need to pretend anymore, and for a long moment she didn't move, didn't react at all. And Jonah feared he'd made a terrible mistake, that he'd pushed too hard. But then her hands began to shake, and slowly, painfully slowly, she lifted her head, her eyes meeting his with a rawness that stole his breath. And when she spoke, her voice came out soft and uneven, like something unused, but unmistakably real. And she said the first words Jonah would ever hear from her, words that carried years of fear inside them. "Please don't make me go back." The truth poured out after that, halting at first, then rushing like a dam finally broken. And she told him how her father drank himself into cruelty, how pretending to be deaf had begun as a shield against his rages, how silence had kept her safe when nothing else could, how people stopped hitting you as hard when they believed you couldn't hear their anger. And Jonah listened, tears burning his eyes, hands clenched so tight his nails cut into his palms, because no child should ever learn survival like that. He promised her, swore it with a voice thick with emotion, that no one would ever sell her again, that no one would hurt her in his home. And when she finally cried, the sound broke something open in him, washing away years of loneliness and grief he hadn't known how to release. But the past doesn't stay buried just because you want it to. And trouble arrived one afternoon in the form of a deputy and a furious drunk man who'd sobered just enough to realize what he'd sold. And Jonah stood between them and the girl without hesitation, his body a shield, his voice steady as he declared that she was staying, that the law had been followed, that no one would take her back. And when the girl stepped forward then, trembling but determined, and spoke clearly in front of them all, telling the truth of what she'd endured, the lie she'd lived, and the silence she'd used to survive, the world finally listened. The deputy's face hardened, the drunk man's rage collapsed into fear, and as he was led away in chains, Jonah felt something close to justice settle over the land like a long-awaited rain. Time healed what it could, and the ranch changed with it, laughter slowly finding its way back into rooms that had known only quiet, and the girl, no longer hiding, no longer silent, began to live instead of merely endure, her voice growing stronger, her smile more frequent, and Jonah realized one evening, as they sat watching the sun bleed into the horizon, that loneliness had not left him empty. It had prepared him, shaped him into someone capable of protecting something fragile and precious when it finally arrived. He didn't buy a servant that day at the auction, and he didn't save a broken girl. Instead, two wounded souls found each other in the dust and learned how to heal together, and in the end, it was her courage that taught Jonah the most important truth of all, that sometimes silence is not weakness, but survival, and sometimes love begins the moment someone finally hears you.